begin with this. Even though I was not academically inclined till after I came to Christ and actually had the influence of Lewis's writings in my life, I always had a love affair with words. I remember the first time I ever fell in love with a word. It was in first grade. Mrs. Reinhardt, our teacher, was going through flashcards for vocabulary buildup. And it was the word swish. It was my first favorite word. I still love that onomatopoeic word, and I fell in love with it long before it was popularized by a clean shot in basketball. Pokey was another word I liked at that time. I love the words ambiguity, perplexed, and subtle. And I can see the very moments when I first heard those words. Or the word ostentatious, which is a word too ostentatious for my vocabulary. There's a word I have in mind. I grew up, as I mentioned, in South Central Los Angeles. I would see the kids going to the cafeteria at my elementary school. I longed to know what that world was like, but it cost 31 cents to go to cafeteria, and that was prohibitive for us. My mother always made us a lunch with a sandwich and a piece of fruit and a couple cookies, and we always had something to eat, but I didn't know what cafeteria life was like. And one day in third grade, to my complete surprise, my mother handed me 31 cents when I left the house, and she said, "You can eat in the cafeteria today." I was worried I might lose the money, so all during the day before cafeteria, I kept grabbing my pocket to make sure that money was still there. And I went into the cafeteria, and though I couldn't have described it this way then, these were my feelings. That being unfamiliar with the sociological protocols of cafeteria life, I might do something utterly stupid and counter to the culture, and everybody would make fun of me. So I gave the lady at the cash register my 31 cents and was relieved to do so. And I watched the girl in front of me with intensity. She grabbed her fiberglass tray, I did as she did. She put her knife, fork, and spoon on the tray, I did as she did, her napkin as well. I moved that tray to that chrome roll bar counter. Do you remember that chrome roll bar counter in elementary school? And the first item that was on the menu were string beans. I hated string beans. And I thought this cafeteria life wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Apparently the girl in front of me didn't like them very well either, because she said, "I'll have a small portion of those, please." I'd never heard the word portion before in my life. I watched with intensity as the cafeteria lady. Do you remember her? She was kind of a large woman, and she had gray hair and a hairnet, and she had a white outfit on with a white apron with lots of smudge marks on it. She was the ubiquitous cafeteria lady who worked in every elementary school cafeteria in America. The girl said, "I'll have a small portion of those, please." And the woman turned around, grabbed a little bowl, grabbed a huge spoon with holes in it so the juices could go through. She dug deep down into a pot, put 3 string beans in the bowl. And I said to the cafeteria lady, "I'll have a small portion of those too, please." And she did the same thing for me. I went on down the line, I put different things on my tray. And when I got to the end, remember that's where the desserts were, I saw the most economically cut pieces of chocolate cake I'd ever seen in my world. And I wondered if that word had other applications. So I said to the cafeteria lady, "I'll have a large portion of that, please." And she cut me the biggest piece of chocolate cake I'd ever seen in my life. And I thought to myself, that is a good word. The psalmist says, "Whom have I in heaven but thee? And besides thee I desire nothing on earth. My heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." I don't want a bigger portion of C.S. Lewis. I want a bigger portion of God. But the one thing that will cause me to have a diminished portion of God is if I have a swollen portion of myself. In the letters, one of the most dominant themes running through the Screwtape letters are Screwtape trying to woo his patient through wormwood into this swollen sense of self, into pride. And I want us then to unpackage this. There's 31 letters that comprise C.S. Lewis's Screwtape letters. Of these, each letter contains approximately 1 to 3 themes. Some of these themes, such as pride, the rationalization of evil, we already called it acrasia in one of the earlier lectures, and the temptations of the flesh occur with great frequency, and those are the three themes I want to unpackage. And it's due to the frequency of these themes that I'll devote these next lectures to these topics. The first of these topics, as I mentioned, is pride, a swollen sense of self, which makes me less and less dependent upon God and have a diminished view of him. Pride basically is man trying to play God of his own life. Every definition of sin in the Bible has this as the dominant concept embedded in what it means to sin. In Romans 3:23 it says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." The Greek word for sin, hamartia, from which the theological doctrine of sin, hamartiology, comes, was an archer's term. If the archer took an arrow from his quiver, knocked the arrow in the bow, and shot it at the target, if the arrow fell short of the mark, it was called a hamartia. For all have sinned and fallen short of what mark? The glory of God. We've assumed a position we were unqualified for. And that's basically what sin is. The sins are a resulting consequence of our mismanagement of our own lives once we've abandoned God's right to rule and reign over them. God knows that we are having a diminished experience as human beings if we are estranged from him. He seeks to woo us back. Screwtape wants us to be as estranged as possible forever if he would have his way. In 1 John 3:4, it says that sin is lawlessness. Sin is not antinomian, against the law. Sin in that passage in the Greek is anomos. It's without law. It is anarchistic, deriving its own standards from itself. It plays God and spins its own morality out from itself like a spider spinning its web. In Genesis, as Satan tempts Eve, he appeals to her by telling her that eating the fruit will allow her to be like God in Genesis 3:5. Similarly, pride, as Lewis defined it in Mere Christianity, is self-conceit. It's the opposite of humility. It is the essential vice, Lewis says, leading to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Now, how we get to pride, we'll look at in the last lecture that we have, as we look at the antidote to Screwtape's advice. I think pride is at the end of a process. It's not the beginning of the process, but we'll talk more about that later. It is essential vice leading to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Lewis concludes his chapter on pride with these words: "If anyone would like to acquire humility, I can, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud." And we'll encounter that realization in the mirror of Screwtape letters as Lewis holds it up to us. He says it's a biggish step too. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think you are not conceited, it means you're very conceited indeed. And this hints at Screwtape's strategy to keep a person proud and not to allow the slightest hint of real humility to begin to emerge. Let us look through the letters listed and let us see if we can find various nuances and subtleties of pride as Lewis discusses them. Pride, as we've already noted, and Screwtape's desire, the hellish experience, is to deny reality and put self in God's place. After that, everything is a projection or a deployment of what we've already described as the transforming imagination. So Screwtape seeks to take good things and corrupt them with pride, even humility, even prayer, even the church. Lewis allows Screwtape to write this to Wormwood: "Your patient has become humble," in letter number 14. "Have you drawn his attention to the fact? All virtues are less formidable to us," Screwtape writes, "once the man is aware that he has them, but this is especially true of humility." Screwtape is not creative. He takes the good thing and perverts it. Lewis says all evil is a perversion of good. You can't think of a good banana, a bad banana, without thinking of a good banana that went bad. Evil compares to good like bread mold compares to bread. It feeds on the original thing. But even man made in the image of a creator can take bread mold and make penicillin from it, something good out of something bad. And so too, God could take the worst of evil events, as he demonstrated at Calvary, and make of it divine penicillin and the ultimate healing medicine for the worst ailment of all, our sin and our pride. Pride is self-centered and self-exalting, and as such estranges us from the real world where God and others can be met. It engages in projection of self and self-interest onto the world around us and thereby becomes utilitarian. Pride results in attempts to actually alter reality, and this is seen in Screwtape's advice relative to humility. Screwtape says again in letter 14, conceal from the patient the true end of humility. He doesn't want him to see that humility leads to God. Instead, he says, let him think of it not as self-forgetfulness, but as a certain kind of opinion, namely a low opinion of himself, of his own talents and characters. In other words, false humility is dishonest. It's dishonest about others and it's dishonest about ourselves. Make him value an opinion for some other quality than truth, thus introducing an element of dishonesty and make-believe into the heart of what otherwise threatens to become a virtue. And since what they are trying to believe may, in some cases, be manifest nonsense, they cannot succeed in believing it, and we have a chance of keeping their minds endlessly revolving on themselves in an effort to achieve the impossible. I remember once being at a church potluck, and this woman started talking about this one dessert that was on the table. She said, that is the best banana cream pie I've ever tasted. It is so wonderful. And she went on and on about it. And somebody said, oh, do you know who made it? And the woman said, I did. It was good pie. To acknowledge the truth was an act of humility. It wasn't arrogant. I tasted it. It really was good pie. Humility is not running yourself down. Humility is a synonym for honesty. Humility is the willingness to adjust the scoliosis of our thinking to the plumb line of reality. And if reality says this is good, we acknowledge it. And it may even be some good that we, by the grace of God, were able to do. The enemy wants him, in the end, Screwtape writes, to be so free from any bias in his own favor that he can rejoice in his own talents as frankly and gratefully as in his neighbor's talents, or in a surprise, or in an elephant, or in a waterfall. He wants each man in the long run to be able to recognize all creatures, even himself, as glorious, excellent things. True humility cultivates eyes that see God's purposes unfold in his creation, how each is made, how each has uniqueness in order to serve God and others. But each of us is intolerant of pride when we see it in others, of course. But a false humility is manifest in our blindness to pride in our own lives every time it raises its ugly head. There's a famous story of Muhammad Ali, arguably the greatest fighter in American history. And he was on an airplane. And the flight attendant came by and said, please fasten your seatbelt, Mr. Ali. And he said, Superman don't need no seatbelt. And she said, no, and Superman don't need no airplane either. Please fasten your seatbelt, Mr. Ali. T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, was one of the great academics at Oxford University. He was a fellow at All Souls. They have no undergraduate students there. It's just researchers. He was steeped in his understanding of classical languages, Middle Eastern languages, as well as the European languages. He became a soldier in World War I, and you know the story about Lawrence. After the war was over, he sought anonymity, and so he took a pseudonym and became a mere RAF airman.